Make every night a wonderful journey, no matter where you are. Good night, sweet dreams. The first story, Shades. Have you ever seen something darting in the corner of your eye? Suddenly had this inexplicably immense fear that was just crushing you. Wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible, even though is a comfortable home. Your home? Have a nagging curiosity that has been driving you insane lately? Feel like you're being watched? Developed an irrational and superstitious mentality and a morbid obsession with the unknown and paranormal? You are experiencing what is commonly known as shadow people. It is something which is becoming increasingly prevalent. But what are they? Some people report that they are inhuman, and some speculate they travel between dimensions, and others shrug it off as sensory perception. But anyone who has experienced this will typically tell you they don't know. They don't want to know. What do they want? What is their purpose? Nothing happens randomly, right? But there is one question you haven't asked. In fact, the very reason why you ask the above questions is to suppress it. In doing so, you think you have victory. You have overcome your fear. But no, you have made it worse. Your inquisitive nature grows each day as a result. The question, where do they come from? It's throbbing in your head, snatching sleep from you, tiring you out with subsidiary questions, until you finally snap and investigate. I was once like you. I was fascinated by the paranormal. I had experienced several experiences, some auditory, some optical, perhaps even what you might call a poltergeist. It was during this time that I had my first encounter with these beings. It started out like a typical encounter, only this one wasn't shy or malicious. It was benign. It came when I longed for a son after my son had died in a house fire. The house was mine. The being comforted me. I didn't wonder why it came to me. I just acknowledged it, let it be, and started rebuilding my life. I got a new job, a new house, all of life's essentials, most of them actually. I could never remarry after the divorce, and it followed me. As days went by, I found myself lacking fear when burglars intruded. It scared them off when I suffered from infestation. It made them disappear when I went outside. I would suddenly be compelled to do things of extreme caliber, and I did them one time. I was a vigilante, well, sorta. One day, I decided to jump off a cliff, overlooking wild rushing water and gleaming jagged rocks. Yet I felt reassured. You could have called me crazy back then, and I wouldn't have heard it. Just shrugged it off. But when I looked down into the water, I could have sworn I saw my deceased child drowning in the cries. They just weren't surreal. I could recognize his voice. I started to feel sick, dizzy, and tired. I thought of immediately moving away from the cliff, but someone pushed me. I didn't fall, which is why I'm still alive today. I had moved away from the cliff quick enough, so I was shoved onto the ground. It was then that I realized what this thing was trying to do. It was trying to kill me, but I tolerated it. I could see no incentive for expelling it, until it took everything away from me. I would get angry for no reason, when no one was around. I would yell at my pets, pick fights, get in trouble with the cops, etc. But that wasn't the worst of it. First, when I went on an afternoon walk with my dog, he got shot during a shootout. He died. The being was nowhere until it came at midnight, stirring me up and urging me to come with it. I ignored it. When I woke up, I got a knock on the door and was greeted with the police, who reported complaints from my neighbors about loud screeches coming from my house. I then got a call. It was from my boss. I was fired, Bob, and I had been long acquainted with each other. This wasn't like him. He hanged up before I could talk with him, before he could explain why the next day I found my car damaged in a car accident, but the driver wasn't around and no one would help me. A few weeks later, I met someone who I could have potentially married, but it was there, and it frightened her off. But these weren't enough to break me. I did not have much attachment, so it targeted my past. I returned home one day and found everything displaced. But what really pissed me off was finding the frames containing photos of my deceased family in shambles and the pictures scattered all over the place. After hours of repairing, repositioning the objects, I noticed something amiss. Where were my son's pictures? Oddly, the family photos didn't have him in them at all. He wasn't on my lap. He wasn't in his bed when I kissed him goodnight. It had taken him out of the objects that I had treasured. Out of my memory. Perhaps this was the last straw. It had to go. I yelled at it and demanded that it leave me alone. I coldly told it how much I hated its company and hated everything it did for me. I did not feel any sympathy at that moment, although I sometimes found myself regretting it. I demanded it return the photos for a second there. I was truly afraid, the first time in my life ever since meeting this entity, that it would suddenly become hostile and attack me. But it just left, and it hasn't returned ever since. I discovered the photos of my son in a pile under the couch, but he never returned in my family photos. Perhaps he was never there. Impossible, after it had left. I did a search on the premises of my old home. After asking several people, I found someone who had lived here for a long time. It turns out that many censuses had been conducted here in the house, and it was built over a burial ground. I did more searching, but it turned up nothing. 10 years later, I'm a religion teacher, but I'm hardly religious, far from it actually. I have abandoned my searching, once lived a life of a recluse. Nothing unusual has happened to me since that incident, but during one of my religion studies, while I was teaching on the subjects of prosperity, resilience, submission, and the moral implications of calling it quits to win in the vices of vengeance, I found a peculiar verse. The shades tremble beneath the waters and the inhabitants thereof. After 10 years of non-compliance, refusal to get worked up over something that will lead me nowhere, my curiosity re-emerged. I initiated another search, and this time I got a good lead. I found that shades is translated as Rephaim in Hebrew. They were inhabitants of the netherworld, the land of the dead, what is now known as the grave. This is from Wikipedia. The HEB root means heel, and thus the mass, through nominalized form of this root, may indicate that these deceased ancestors could be invoked for ritual purposes that would benefit the living. That would explain the census, the being's attraction to me, the familiarity I had for him, the feeling that he was once human. But one question, long forgotten but never quelled, began to ring in my head. Where do they come from? I found another verse a few days later. Your dead will live, their corpses will rise, those who lie dead in the dust will wake up and shout for joy, because your dew is a refreshing dew, and the earth will revive the spirits of the dead. Believers of the Bible will interpret this as resurrection, befitting of their religion and interests, but I know what it was. I know what it is. I know what I saw. It is a journey, a reunion, the result of our grief, the result of our demands. They hear, they know, they think, they wish to, just like us, and they are coming, and I know what they whisper. Why they arrive to comfort us in our time of greatest need, and what they wish to convey to us. It is a message, an invitation to a gathering of old and new, to a timeless procreation of past and present intertwined, but with only good, to a place of comfort and of silent recluse. I now know they are not shadows, they are cloaked beings. They do not come to frighten, they come to warn us of an impending doom. You'll know too, when death comes knocking at your door. Rising, the great journey waits for no one, friend. Not even you, but when it does, when the time comes, when your time comes, therein you shall find rest. You'll know that they come to deliver us from sorrow, and bring us to hereafter. The second story, later days. I had never bought anything off of eBay before, but I was in a phase where I would reminisce off of all of the old TV shows I grew up on. So, I began scouring the internet for certain things that could give me that nostalgic feeling. I happened to stumble upon a user who was selling an unreleased episode of an old show that aired on the Family Channel, called The Weekenders, on a CD for only $7. I was slightly curious about the low price, but I just figured that it was because he didn't want it. I'm a television enthusiast, so this was an exciting moment for me, being able to see an episode of that hadn't even been released, or seen by anyone else other than the person who was selling it. I would watch it when I was 11 or so, every morning before school. The disc finally arrived and it came in one of those blank CD cases. So I was hoping I didn't get JIPP. BD. The disc had a label on it, written in black letters on a somewhat worn white label. Kind of a brown tinge. It said dismissed. I thought in my head that because it wasn't released, that it had to have been dismissed. So I didn't give too much thought to it. It was getting dark outside, and my living room had a dark blue hue to it. As the sun was almost down, my parents were at work and my brother asleep. I popped the disc into the DVD player on my TV and waited. The player usually worked quite quickly, and surprised me that it didn't start quickly. Well, the disc was $7. You get what you pay for. I was sitting on my couch directly in front of the TV, just looking at a black screen. It faded to a frame that was only on for a brief moment. I thought I missed something, so I rewinded it back to the scene and paused. It was the Bahia Bay News lady with the headline covered by a black box, and a blurry picture of what looked like a blue and red object in a plastic bag, next to a yellow card that had an X on it. I felt rather puzzled by what I was looking at, but I had to proceed to watch the rest. The theme song played as normal. I felt a sense of nostalgia as I saw the characters' name cards come up. Carver, Lower, Tish, and I was shocked at the fact that Tino's was missing. The three characters danced in front of the title card without Tino. I figured this is why the episode was pulled. A mishap by the artists or something. The word Friday came up on the screen, and I saw the four of the characters, including Tino, walking across a beach backdrop. They were talking about Chloe Montez's latest incident, a fridge magnet stuck to her braces. I and the characters had a good laugh. My living room was completely dark by now, and I was relaxed into my couch. I watched on as they went to the mall and buy a costume store. They all went in as it showed Laura and Tish trying on funny-looking hats. Tino was walking up the aisle, looking at the capes. He was feeling the material on one in particular, and was to indulge to notice Carver sneaking up behind him. Carver then jumped at Tino, wearing a clown mask, with black paint around the eyes, a big red nose, and a smile. Tino jumped out of his skin and fell to the floor in the fetal position as assumed. They all laughed at his reaction, just looking at him. The shock into Tino's face, eyes closed as a tear ran down his cheek, sobbing under his breath. As his friends continued to laugh, he hopped up and ran. I found this unusual, because I was outraged that they would laugh at him while he was in tears. As Tino ran, the sky turned grayer and darker, running home with the tears running down his face. This seemed very grim for a Weekender's episode. He opened the door to his house. The lights weren't on, but he could see his mum, passed out on the couch. He walked over to her, and as he touched her shoulder to see his mother's face, a deafening scream took over my speakers. I scrambled frantically to turn down the volume. The image became very detailed. His mother was deceased. Blood was running from the gash in her cheek. Her eyes were popped out of her head, almost looking like they were staring at the viewer. Her hair was frazzled and discolored. Tino then backed off as his mother's body fell violently at his feet. I was clutching onto my couch cushion. Tino ran upstairs and slammed his door, then sat with his back to it. The TV went silent. At first I thought I'd accidentally hit the mute button, but the volume was up. Tino sat quietly at the door, staring at the wall for about 3 minutes. He stood up and walked over to his dresser. There was a pill bottle, and he tossed it at the wall violently before taking off his shirt. He opened up the drawer to find a blue knife in a green box. He looked into the mirror. As he slammed it on the table, he broke the fourth wall by staring into the camera. Kind of a usual twist to this unusual episode. He stared at me for a good minute and a half. A blank stare. Not blinking, his eyes widened, and what almost looked like a smile crept onto his face as he walked closer. He then said, "You want me to do it onto you?" Very loudly. It sounded so real, like he was sitting next to me, yelling into my ear. He smiled at me for a moment as he flicked the knife and put it to his face. I was dumbfounded by fear. I couldn't move. He dug the blade into his eyelid. As the dark red liquid ran down his face, his screams were high-pitched, and nothing I'd ever heard before. He dug the blade into both eyelids. As the liquid ran down his face and onto his chest, he screamed once again as he dug it into his nose. I could hear the blade going in. He proceeded to cut the sides of his mouth. The effects in the show seemed greater, more realistic than before. I watched as the blood pouring down his face formed the face of a clown. His blonde hair was soaked in blood. He ran around the room, laughing and putting his hands on his face. He fell to the ground. A lot of blood was coming out of his nose, and he fell so his head rested on the step up to his bed. The floor had a puddle of blood on it. It went quiet until he turned to the camera. Once again Tino lifted his head slightly. As his eyes stared me down, he said with his voice muffled by the blood later day, as his head hit the step, with blood rushing from everywhere, eyes still open, a grin on his blood-soaked face. He was staring at me, and I waited for the credits to roll, but they never came. I went to turn it off and go back to the menu. I tried pressing the button, but it didn't work. He was staring me down as the blood rushed from his skull to the floor. I stood up and turned off the TV. My entire room was black. I was sweating like crazy and frantically trying to find a light. I turned it on and stared at my TV, still off. I unplugged the DVD player and took it off to the side. I then turned on my TV again to see the same face, Tino, wide-eyed and deceased, now having dry blood on his face. Cracking, I felt tears in the back of my eyes for some reason as I turned it off again. I unplugged the TV and sat in silence as I waited for my dad to get home. I started having nightmares after I saw it, and since then, and visited therapy to this day. I don't know what happened, but for some reason, every time I turn on that TV, I see his face. No one else sees it but me, but I always see it. I always see it. I always. The third story, holder of chastisement, in any city, in any country. Go to any mental institution or halfway house you can get yourself to. When you reach the front desk, ask for the one who calls herself the holder of chastisement. If a look of utter anguish crosses the worker's face, count yourself lucky, for you have come to the right place. The worker will lead you through a door behind the desk that you could have sworn wasn't there before. Go through the door and make sure to follow the worker closely, because getting lost in these dark holes would mean the end of you, but not of your endless torment. Hours into your journey you will come upon a large steel door, and your guide will make a move to open its top end. For if you do not, he will lock you out, and you will be forced to wander the halls for all of time and beyond. Instead, in your guide's life it does not matter how you do it, but from here on you must continue alone. The door will feel extremely light even though it is massive in size. Speaking of continuing alone, be sure to lock the door behind you. You don't want anything interrupting you in your task. On the other side of the door you will see a headless woman with a whip, her body covered in lashes stained dark crimson with blood. She will point to a carved stone guillotine in the corner of the room. Approach it and strap yourself in before the woman grows angry. There's no telling what she may do if you take too long, for no one's ever survived or tarried. The woman will then proceed to strike you with her whip, one lash for every wrongdoing you have ever committed. Many cannot handle the pain and scream, but this is the one thing you must never do. You must keep a look of determination on your face and make no sound above a whimper, lest the blade come crashing down. If you retain your life and your sanity through your chastisement, you will be allowed to ask your one question: how were they punished? Though she does not speak, you will hear a voice echo in your mind. It will tell you of how they were punished the last time the objects were brought together, of the penalties and vengeance exacted on them, and the pain they suffered. When the voice stops, you will be released. You have less than a second to get out of the way before the blade descends, severing your head and leaving you in the woman's place as holder. If you make it, you will wake up in your home in a cold sweat, the whip clutched tightly in your hand. The whip is object 115 of 538. It longs for the flesh of those who would reunite them. Previous next.